So we're on our next essay about whether or not the territorial expansion in the early 1800s, was it good for the country or maybe not so good? It's a popular question to go over in APUSH, so we're going to talk about it right now. Okay, quick little review. This is where we start at about 1800, so most of the land that we get there is from the American Revolution, if not, the original 13 colonies. And this is where we're ending at about 1850. So the country's looking a little bit more like what we have right today. So we're jumping from a third of our size to our current size, almost. So why would national unity be something that we would want to talk about? Well, we're still a relatively new country by the early 1800s, and you want to make people feel like we are part of a whole unit. So if maybe getting land, maybe winning a couple wars is going to be part of that, it's a good idea. Also, we really haven't secured our own position in terms of world affairs. Most countries aren't taking us very seriously yet. Well, we haven't really proven a whole lot. Regional differences are still really stronger than having a national identity. People are still partial to being from New England or being maybe from Virginia. Those regional differences are actually coming stronger as we get closer to the Civil War. So if there's something that can maybe unify us, all the better. A strong sense of nationalism is not only going to empower the country to feel as whole, but will help us probably modernize, maybe do more in terms of industry, do more in terms of westward expansion. So these are all relatively good things, and that's kind of the part of it here. All right, so the first big purchase is going to be the Louisiana Purchase. 1803, Thomas Jefferson is going to be able to take advantage of Napoleon's kind of economic situation in Europe, and so he's going to be able to create a great deal here. We are going to double the size of our country in just a few swipes of a pen, so to speak. It is going to cost us around $15 million. If you break it down, it's about 3 cents an acre. You're never going to get a deal like that ever again. So even though Thomas Jefferson is a little hesitant on this, all of the Senate says, let's do this. Of course, we have Lewis and Clark, and they go exploring, trying to mark our territory, so to speak, and trying to make some kind of relation with the Native American tribes that are there. So this is that growing sense of nationalism, is now we are so much bigger because of this. So really for Thomas Jefferson, he's seeing this as unlimited potential for not only farmers, but others now for trade, maybe trade with the Pacific countries. This is something that we're hoping for, to find a way, a westward moving a river that will hopefully connect us to the Pacific. Even though we technically don't have the land in California or Oregon, we're still going to be traveling there. So in that green area is going to be the land that we get at Louisiana Purchase, and of course some states or also partial states. All right, the Missouri Compromise, 1820. So here we are, we have Missouri. They are hoping to become a slave state. And that's making a lot of Northerners feel uncomfortable because, as you can see, Missouri is a little bit more north than some of the other slave states, the ones that had not already been established. So how are we going to make this deal here? Because we want to keep things balanced in the Senate. That's really the whole point, keeping everybody happy. So we are going to make a state called Maine, and it's not really ready to become a state, but we're going to fudge it a little bit so that we can keep that balance going. And to kind of throw in more of the deal, any territory north of the 3630 line that you see there in red, that had to remain free. So that unorganized territory that you see, it really wasn't too much of a concern. I think most of that territory, we weren't really even sure when we were going to really go exploring. It was all really Native American land, and it didn't look too promising for us at the time. Henry Clay is going to be the great compromiser here, and we're going to talk about him again in 1850. Both sides are not 100% pleased with this act. And again, that kind of makes sense. If it's a compromise, no one's ever going to be 100% happy. The South was upset because Congress was trying to regulate slavery, and the North is unhappy because slavery gets extended. It's not going to stay in the original territory of the South. So this is going to hold up until the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. So now we're going to talk about Texas a little bit here. Texas is going to fight for their freedom in 1835 over Mexico, and they immediately want to become a slave state. But America's not quite ready for this. A couple different questions pop up. This could bring a war with Mexico, because really Mexico's not ready to admit that they lost Texas, and some people are simply not ready to have another slave state, and a state that would be incredibly large. So the annexation does finally take place in 1854 after many years of debate. President Tyler is going to argue that Britain might make a deal with Texas, and that could threaten maybe our national security. And we don't really want a foreign government, such as Britain, right next so close to us. Many are going to argue that this is going to bring us to war with Mexico, that is also a concern about our national security, and Mexico seemed much more of a threat than the British. The abolitionists are outraged. They fought very hard not to have another slave state, and here it is, and it's a very large one. So the country is going to be very much divided over whether or not it was a good idea to take Texas. But at the same time, we're starting to experience this thing called manifest destiny. This is a picture that we looked at in class. I've seen it on lots of AP tests, so get comfortable with it. So what does this term exactly mean? It's coined in 1845 by newspaper editor John L. O'Sullivan. And if something is manifest, it's going to be obvious. So it's our obvious destiny that we should control all the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And to toss it in there, it was ordained by God. So some Americans are going to buy into this, and they're going to start migrating west. Others are going to not buy into this because, again, they fear that extension of slavery. So this isn't exactly a term that's completely embraced by everybody, but it's a term that's actually going to come up again in the end of the 1800s when we start to think about imperializing. But for our purposes, this is supposed to increase nationalism, make us feel good about ourselves. But not everybody is going to buy into this, again, because it has to do with possibly slavery expanding. But even though there are tensions, many Americans are going to move. They're going to move on to Oregon and even settle in California before we technically control California. That's where they're going to be heading. They want land, they want cheap land, they want opportunity. And Americans have always had this kind of wanderlust, so they're always happy to keep moving and going. For the most part, this is seen as a positive. Okay, we've got a growing population, immigrants are coming every day, where's everybody going to live? We also see this possible increase with trade and also raw materials. So that's good because we don't exactly know what we have out there, and this is all the better way to really explore it. But again, it's that nagging question of what about slavery? And Americans assumed that our country was right, that our way of life was right, that our government was right, our culture was right, and that anybody in our past, such as the Mexicans and Native Americans, are simply wrong, and they're going to have to live under our rules, so to speak. So we're not really taking into consideration anybody else's land rights, so we're just kind of pushing our way through, as that picture had rightly shown, that the Native Americans and even the buffalo are going to be pushed out of the way of the so-called civilization of America. Well, some people were worried about war with Mexico, and we get a war with Mexico. The war is going to begin over a Texas border dispute. I'm not too worried about all the details here. We've talked about this in class. Some Americans are not going to be happy with this war. They question whether or not the war was even legitimate. You've got Abraham Lincoln with the Spot Resolution, and we've talked about that. But also others are simply going to fear the spread of slavery, and no war is going to be worth having if that means slavery is going to keep extending. Now remember, people are going to be anti-slavery for moral reasons, but also economic reasons. Think about the free soiler. So it's not just about that it's unethical. So skipping the actual war, not too worried about that. Let's go to the treaty where we're going to get a whole lot of land. Texas is going to get the border that it wants, which is the Rio Grande River. And then America is going to gain California, New Mexico, and the Arizona territories, which makes about almost 6 states for about $15 million. So it's quite a deal. Maybe not as good as the Louisiana Purchase, but also land that we were eyeing for quite some time. Again, the question is going to come up, what do we do with slavery? So just give you a little bit of picture here. Our country's starting to look a little bit more like what you know. Of course, all those states in the Plains area are nowhere near being developed yet, but just kind of look at got the area in red, and that's the area that we get from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. All right, so with that treaty, our country is looking more with the regular boundaries that we have today, which means people are going to start to move west. So I just picked this picture because it shows all the different trails that people are going to be taking to head west. And with that goes that question, is slavery going to be welcomed? Now, in some of these territories we've talked about, environmentally speaking, there's really no need to have slaves because you can't grow all these big cash crops. But people are going to bring their own personal slaves. And even if there's just a handful of slaves, that means slavery is going to be extending. And is this going to be worth it? So is this land grab something that is going to unify us or something that is going to continue to regionalize us? Brings us to the Wilmot Proviso. So just as the war is starting with the Mexican government, there's again the question of whether or not slavery is going to extend if we should get any land with this war with Mexico. So there's one congressman, but he's not the only one, that is going to be against slavery. By the way, he's against slavery because economically he thinks it's going to hurt the free white men. So he's more or less like a free soiler. But he's going to propose a ban on the extension of slavery in any territory acquired from the war. Now, that would not include Texas because that would come in as a slave state because it was already there. That was not acquired because of the war. So the Senate is going to stop this proposal, but really the only reason why it can stop it is that because the South is going to dominate the Senate at this point. So this passes the House without any issue because the North is going to dominate the House. This doesn't really solve anything because now the tension is going to increase over slavery, and we're starting to see that division of North versus South in terms of the federal government. So what could have been a great opportunity is going to lead to a lot more frustration. Now, people weren't too concerned about those territories initially because they thought, oh, it's going to take a while before a lot of people move out there. So maybe this is an issue we can push further down the road before these territories are ready for statehood. But lo and behold, we discovered gold in Sutter's Mill. So that's going to bring millions of people to California. I mean, not millions, I think hundreds of thousands, to California. And before you know it, it is able to become a state within about a year. Which brings us to our last big federal piece of legislation, is going to be the Compromise of 1850. Now, this is not your ideal compromise because, again, everybody would be happy, and everybody isn't really happy. But the North is going to be more happy than the South. So California is going to be admitted as a free state, which is going to balance out Texas because California is a pretty big state. Now, the territories of Utah and also New Mexico, environmentally speaking, not your ideal area to have slaves, but it was going to be left to the men who are going to be eventually living in those territories. So they would use popular sovereignty to determine whether or not they'd be free or slave. So you can actually put that bullet point in either the North or the South. It's kind of a tie in terms of who's going to see that as a win or a loss. The end of the slave trade in D.C. This is really something that the abolitionists had pushed for many years. They felt it was humiliating to be the seat of a free government and you can go purchase a slave right down the street from the White House. So they got their toe, I guess you could say, in the door of the South, and that they're ending the slave trade. Now, this isn't all that big of a deal because you can cross the Potomac and go buy your slaves, but at least it's a very symbolic gesture. For the South, Texas was fairly large, and it was going to be a little bit smaller because New Mexico needed a better border, so Texas is going to be paid for the loss of that land. But really the big thing the South wanted was a tougher fugitive slave law. And they already had a fugitive slave law. It wasn't very effectively enforced. This one was supposed to be much tougher. In fact, the judges are going to be paid more if they found a runaway slave actually guilty of being a runaway, which meant most of these people are going to be found guilty. Now, the thing is, the North is going to ignore a lot of this. There's going to be a big outcry over this fugitive slave law. They feel that it's unconstitutional, even though slaves technically don't have constitutional rights, and they fear that this type of use of the law could be used against them. So many Northerners are going to start helping slaves. They're going to take part in the Underground Railroad, and overall the South is not going to see the fugitive slave law they had envisioned. So this compromise is going to work for a short period of time, but then, as we know, things are going to heat up throughout the 1850s, and that's going to be a whole other set of questions that we'll cover in class. But knowing that all of the land we've acquired, that's really what you're focusing on. Is this good for us, or is this going to be not so good for us? Where do you see the benefits, and where do you see the minuses? So those are the questions you should be thinking about in terms of what all this land acquisition is going to mean. And overall, do we have an answer for slavery by 1850? No. So I hope you found this helpful, and prepare for that test.